Seen her 5 times, and every time someone I know ended up dead within hours. I say her, but I'm really not sure if that's even remotely accurate. She has the graceful, elegant, limber movements of a woman, and even though her physique is completely androgynous in nature, I still feel more comfortable imagining her as a woman for some reason. The first time I saw her I had to be around 5 or 6. The ritual is always the same. I wake up in the pitch blackness, unable to move a muscle. Then a slowly growing pale pulsating cyst will appear in the periphery of my vision, eventually birthing the dancer in violent, horrible contractions. She will climb out, pale, tall and spindly, completely hairless. But what really disturbs me is the face. Or lack thereof. I can sort of see the cavities under the thin skin, the flickering movement of her eyes under there, or the way she opens and closes her veiled mouth. She will stand there in the periphery for a while, gently swaying side to side, before she starts dancing. I guess the closest I can come to describe it would be a disturbing version of ballroom dancing. She moves gracefully, mimicking holding her partner, gently floating back and forth, her head constantly turned in my direction. I can see her mouth moving under that pale translucent skin, like she's trying to tell me something. But she never makes a sound. When the unheard music stops, she will too. She would have moved across the room now, usually standing by an exit, either a window or a door. She will continue to move her unseen mouth for a little while, before she slowly fades and becomes one with the darkness. At this point I can choose to wake up. I've only done it twice, the very first time it happened, and the last time it happened. It's not that something horrible happened that first time I woke up. I think it was more the feeling that she hadn't really left. That she was still there somehow, unseen. Hidden just beyond the veil. My heart wouldn't stop pounding. So I climbed back into bed, and hid under the covers, shaking and crying. The next morning we got word that our neighbor had passed away. She was a sweet, old lady, Mrs. Barrow. Died of a heart attack. They said she went peacefully, but I'm not so sure about that anymore. I didn't make the connection back then. How could I? I was barely old enough to understand the finality of death, let alone tie it to a pale faceless nightmare. But then it happened again. 5 years later. The same ritual, the same faceless creature, the same dance. I didn't wake up this time, however. I just slipped back into the comforting warm darkness of sleep. And I woke up to my mom crying. My grandmother had died. They didn't tell me how until a few years later. She drowned in her bathtub. Fallen asleep or had an episode or something. Just collapsed and drowned. 2 years later my uncle died after I was visited by the faceless dancer. Car accident. Must have fallen asleep at the wheel. His body was crushed, mangled, unrecognizable. They had to pick up pieces of him for days. Horrible thing. Now I was old enough though. Old enough to spot the pattern. To question what the faceless dancer really represented. Was it death? A portent of doom, an omen of unrest? Or something else? Something vile and sinister? A horrible, taunting defiler? Or was it just a messenger? Merely a bringer of bad news? I didn't know, and I didn't really care to know. When I was 17 I saw her for the 4th time. This time the dance seemed more intense, more violent, like the unheard music moved in sudden bursts of extreme rhythms. Her face remained still, however, even when her body warped and twisted and turned, the face was motionless, fixated on me. I woke up crying, trembling, dreading the news I knew was coming. My mom was hysterical, torn up, in shambles. My dad had died on his way home from a business trip. His plane had some technical problems, and had to make an emergency landing. When the cabin crew went around to check if everyone was alright, they found my father dead. He'd somehow got entangled in the seat belt, suffocating as the plane made its unplanned landing. It was ruled a freak accident. Look, I know what you're thinking. Well, I know what half of you are thinking. Why don't I tell someone? Why don't I warn them? Do something? Short answer is I've tried. I've tried to tell someone. But they always look at me like I'm either delusional, or some sick freak. I've lost friends because of it. My mom refused to listen to me, and more or less disowned me when I told her about it. No one will take me seriously. And I don't blame them. For the longest while, I didn't even believe it. Just some crazy hallucination caused by sleep paralysis or something. The deaths? Coincidences. Nothing more. I convinced myself of this. And it worked too. For 15 years. Never saw her. Never felt her. It was all in my head, some shitty psychotic episode or mental breakdown or something. I was free. Until a week ago. It started like all the other times. A pulsating pale cyst, leathery and disgusting, throbbing in the periphery. Then she clawed her way out, following the repulsive rhythms of the contractions. She climbed out slowly, rose to her spindly feet. Stood there swaying side to side. Started the graceful dance, her face always fixated on me. Back and forth, her skin-covered mouth moving, forming unheard sentences. She elegantly made her way across the room, and slowly faded away. But I wouldn't have it. Not this time. No one was gonna die because of me ever again. My husband was sound asleep next to me. I'd never told him about the pale dancer. And I never will. My kids were in the next room. Noah and Trinity. I couldn't risk them. I couldn't risk her hurting any of them. So I forced myself awake. Trembling and sweating, I got up and slowly crept to the last place I'd seen her, the door. I don't know quite how to explain it, but there was this residual presence, like an echo of her being. It lingered wherever she'd physically been present, but I felt it stronger where I had last seen her. I opened the door, and slowly made my way to the kids' room. I didn't feel her there. But she was close. I turned around, and immediately let out a hoarse whimper, and stumbled back in shock. She was there. At the end of the hallway. Still dancing, still moving, still mouthing soundlessly towards me. Then she suddenly disappeared around the corner. I swallowed deeply and thought for a second about waking up John, my husband. But I still couldn't risk it. This was something I had to face alone. So I followed her. When I turned the corner, she was halfway down the stairs. Her face was still following me wherever she turned, always fixated on me. My heart was pounding, I was sweating and trembling like a leaf, my mind filled with all the potential gruesome conclusions to this horrendous game of cat and mouse. But I had to know what it meant. So I kept following her. Down the stairs, into the living room, out into the hallway. And then she stopped. She'd reached the door, and just stood there completely motionless. Her mouth wasn't moving anymore either. It was like she was frozen in place. Then she faded again. Without thinking, I fumbled open the lock, and threw open the door. She was still there. Now standing in the middle of the street. She was dancing again, but in a jarring, erratic fashion, her limbs completely out of sync, her head bending in extreme, unnatural angles. "Stop it!" I suddenly yelled hysterically. She stopped. Just like that. I moved closer to her, stepped out the door. Over the threshold. And as soon as my body had left the house, she was standing right behind me. I could feel her cold breath on my neck, her spindly hands on my shoulders. I turned around in shock. And I screamed. Her mouth was open. A bloody, gaping wound, the fleshly skin flapping disgustingly as her hoarse, croaking voice penetrated my ears. "Thank you," she whispered, "thank you for leaving." She stepped into the house and the door slammed shut. I freaked out. Completely lost it. The door wouldn't budge and I couldn't even imagine what was going on in there. Who she was taking from me this time. I banged and clawed and kicked the door, before I finally came to my senses, found a rock, and threw it through one of the windows. The glass shattered instantly, the shards spreading everywhere. I cut myself badly as I clumsily stepped through it. I raced up the stairs. I've never felt fear like that. Never. The mere thought of anyone hurting my kids sent tremors of terror, horror, rage, and sadness, all mixed into a hurricane of unending distress. I more or less kicked the kids' door open, only to find both of them sound asleep. Then I heard the screams coming from my bedroom. Our bedroom. Bestial screams. Screams of utter torment. "No!" I yelled as I stumbled down the hallway and into our bedroom. She was perched atop my husband. Her face still turned to me. But this time she had a horrible, fleshly, bloody smile on that otherwise featureless visage. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely. Then she faded. Gone in an instant. Vanished. John's eyes were bulging out, his tongue swollen and blue, sticking out between his clenched teeth. His face was purple, but soon turned pale and lifeless. They say he went quickly. But I know better. I know the endless torment he must have endured. Brain aneurysm, they told me. Could happen to anyone. Bad luck. There's no such thing as bad luck around me. Only the pale faceless dancer. And the promise of death.